Democratic backsliding in Taiwan, the systemic risks versus societal norms. So why bother with Taiwan in particular? I think that Taiwan presents a very interesting case study because you have the dichotomy between the systemic and historical incentives for authoritarianism and democratic backsliding in general versus a very consistent pressure from the people agitating for democracy. And the result has been a very slow but eventual triumph of democracy despite everything going against it. And so here's a brief, sort of insufficient background on the topic. It's a very complex situation spanning over a century. For a case study, it begins with the Japanese occupation of Taiwan, which sort of instills a democratic mindset in the people, followed by the Republic of China, who wins World War II and retakes Taiwan and suppresses these democratic elements. The Republic of China then loses to the communists during the Civil War and retreats to Taiwan. Then the communists establish the People's Republic of China and sort of, solidify control over the mainland. The Republic of China slowly fades and becomes, Taiwan. But not before 4 decades of martial law known as the White Terror, and after that, eventual democratization. Very slow, but eventual democratization. So for Taiwan, it's not a story of active backsliding at the moment, but a story of overcoming it and its legacy. Because in Taiwan, like I said, you have the systemic legacy of authoritarianism and democratic erosion. So originally, the Republic of China starts out as a democracy. Then Chiang Kai-shek comes along, sets up an authoritarian rule, cracks down on democracy, sets up basically a dictatorship. Retreats to Taiwan, authoritarianism during the retreat, 4 decades of martial law. Then after Chiang Kai-shek, his son takes over, Chiang Ching-kuo, and there's a slow democratization process. And then eventually, Chiang Ching-kuo allows other parties to run, and you have slowly coming to like a full democratization, quote unquote, just because it's still sort of 2-party rule imperfect, and we'll get into that maybe later. But basically, the counterbalance to this legacy authoritarianism has been the agitation of the people, sort of a bottom-up democratization model, where the people are consistently agitating for democracy and expanding on their rights. Obviously, they can't affect change on their own, and so the legacy, as well as sort of top-down, where after Chiang Kai-shek, because Chiang Kai-shek did nothing, Chiang Ching-kuo allows sort of transition from hard to soft authoritarianism to take place, democratization inside of an authoritarian party, as well as allowing outside institutions to spring up. But even for these modern institutions, they're just reflections of that legacy of authoritarianism, and they're still deeply rooted in that. Even the most progressive of the party, the mainstream party, the DPP, 3 years ago tried implementing education reforms to basically brainwash children in their image, which you need education on national identity for Taiwan in their case, but not to the extent that they were pushing it. And anyway, despite this, all the legacies of authoritarianism, the counterbalance has always been the democratic movements to counteract them. There's always, in today's instance, every 1 to 4 years, some sort of movement springing up to counter something that's happened. And in the case of Taiwan, there's also the special outside factors, which is primarily the PRC. The Civil War technically never ended. So there's consistently threats to Taiwan's democracy from the mainland, basically either from the direct threat of invasion, literally overthrowing democratic rule, but also used to try to turn outcomes in elections. There's the third Taiwan Strait crisis, where the unfavorable election for the PRC was met with basically missile launches near the island to threaten them. If I remember correctly, that part I haven't researched yet. But also the use of threats just to influence elections in general and politics. Another outside force is the US. Once again, this delves into the historical background because it's the 1960s and 70s where this is most prevalent, but basically during the peak of Taiwan's repression, at least in the modern sense, the US steps in to try to curb human rights abuses. And it should be noted the US government didn't do this out of the kindness of their heart. That's not the US government's MO. This was because the public was so outraged that they made Congress act. So the tentative conclusions for a case study of Taiwan is that the precursors to the democratic erosion is that their internal parties are just simply predisposed to adopt authoritarian practices to maintain power because that's the legacy of what they've come into. And there's sort of the direct and indirect influence from the mainland that always is pushing them towards more illiberal practices to sort of bring them in line with the mainland's policies. But also that fundamental uncertainty of Taiwan's position as a sovereign state means that their institutions are very rigid and poorly equipped to adapt to democratic challenges because, for instance, the Constitution 1947 is still in place despite no longer controlling the mainland, and it's a constitution designed to control the mainland. And they can't reform it because that would be tantamount to declaring independence, and China has promised to invade if they do that. So they're in limbo, and so they can't fully overhaul these institutions to address democratic values. So it's just a fundamental mismatch. They're coping very well, but there's a fundamental mismatch. And so the symptoms are that there's just consistent attempts by the main parties on the national level to erode the liberties of the people. Mostly from the KMT and their policies aligned with the mainland, but both parties do it, like I mentioned with the DPP education reforms. And so the result is just a really unresponsive and uncooperative national government. I should say national, because on a local level, it's not that terrible. It's still bad, but it's not terrible. And the resilience for Taiwan is that despite all this, Taiwan is a thriving democracy because the unrelenting efforts of its people to hold their institutions accountable and responsive. In this previous slide, the background is literally the people occupying the legislature. And they were invited in. This isn't a January 6th riot. I think the DPP invited them in to stop some authoritarian legislation, but fundamentally the people are very committed to their democracy, even when the government is actively trying to erode it. And so the case study of Taiwan is overall a lesson for how a population should act to uphold democratic values when their institutions fail them and they're, in the case of Taiwan, like stuck in limbo almost. Just some side notes. I know we discussed for case studies that we want to limit historical background, but for Taiwan, because they're in this limbo, the historical legacy is just so important. And that's, 70 years that they've been in limbo. So it's just 70 years of history that you have to kind of cover in some extent or another. And for the professor, because the historical background will be so extensive, I'm going to try to offset it by adding to the proper analysis portion of the paper. So thank you very much.